Auntie Tina's Antiques, and this week we are talking about hats and the history of hats, which obviously goes way back. Probably there was somebody way back at the beginning that thought, I'm going to cover my head and figured out it protected them from the sun, and if they pulled it close, it protected their ears. And probably didn't take very long before everybody else was figuring the same thing out. And so before you know it, everybody was wearing something over their head. And it became so commonplace that my guess is that the community leaders would look around and see everybody has their head covered and everybody looks the same except for that weirdo over there. So then we started making community laws or religious laws that said that our heads must be covered because a covered head showed religious respect. And that's pretty much the way things stayed for a very long time. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages, our people were wearing hats. Not necessarily hats, but head covering. It was probably about the 16th century that we start seeing more structured hats. In fact, it's about 1593 that we see the first reference to a milliner, which was a person who created hats. And it comes from Milan, Italy. So most likely the person that earned that term milliner was somebody, and the people that were bringing the styles and the manufacturing skills from Milan, Italy into the rest of Europe and like England and Great Britain. So that's why the term stuck, was the milliner, because they were from Milan, Italy. And we look later on throughout history, and that milliner mylar kind of combination goes around, and it comes out that that's the fiber that you could get from Italy that was making the straw hats that were later popular. It's about the 1700s that we start seeing the women's hats take a direction of their own. Prior to that, they were pretty much just like men's hats. So then about the 17th century, they start looking like their own style and their own thing. And they become really popular. But we know by the 18th century, or the 1700s, most people are wearing some sort of head covering, whether it be a scarf or a veil or a hat or a bonnet. They were wearing something over their head. And it obviously, because it's, what we do as humans, it started becoming a social status. And your hats were a reflection of who you were in society. For example, the non-noble people, especially the non-noble men, were required to wear wool hats on Sunday. And that's where the flat cap came from. That's a very common, don't have one with me, but it was real common among the non-noble people. And of course the nobles were wearing much more flamboyant hats, more elaborate, because it wasn't until 1797 when Mr. John Hetherington, it may have been Sir John Hetherington, I didn't see that part, stepped out in a top hat, which is kind of like that one. And this top hat was so unusual because it was so tall and so shiny that it caused a minor riot, which I kind of think is a riot. But anyways, Mr. Hetherington ended up having to pay a fine because his hat started a riot, of all things. Who knew? But it wasn't about that same time in the late 1700s. We're looking at, this is the beginning of a lot of the revolutions. We have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and people are liking the idea of democracy a whole lot better. And so their hats wanted to be a reflection of democracy, and that they were all, wearing the same thing. So bonnets for women, even if they were wearing a simple cotton bonnet, which pretty much everybody did inside in their homes. But it became very acceptable at that point to wear some kind of hat that showed that you represented democracy and that you were one of the people. But it didn't take long for us to get past that. So about 1810, we know Napoleon's over there in Europe, and he's taken over quite a bit of the continent. And all of a sudden, that mylar that I mentioned a minute ago, Well, it's no longer available because Napoleon has Italy, and Napoleon's fighting the British, and the British don't have all those things that they used to make their woven bonnet hats out of. So they developed something that was called bonnet board. And towards the beginning of the 1800s, this bonnet board would go in the brim. I have no bonnets here. And it would be very wide. And it was a very wide hat. And a lot more going on in the back. But the idea was to frame your face. And as the 1800s go on, we see that that brim, that wide bonnet brim, starts getting smaller and smaller before you know it. But the hats get wider and wider. One of the popular hats was the shepherdess hat that came about at that time. And by the 1900s, we're looking at, for a lot of women, huge hats. And you often wonder, how were they able to wear these hats? Because even if I'd never cut my hair, I wouldn't have been able to come up with that base to put a hat on. And that's called a pompadour. And a pompadour was like a little frame that they would put around their head, on their head, and they would pull their hair up. And if they didn't have enough hair to cover the pompadour, they would, pull some of that hair out of their brush and stuff and cover it up. But then they would also have very long hat pins that would stick their hats to their heads. Well, that was very convenient for women because by the 1800s, pretty much everybody's wearing hats, right? You didn't leave the house without a hat, including men who had several different styles of hats. But the etiquette for men was a whole lot more complicated than it was for a woman. A woman, if you were outside, you wore a hat. If you were at somebody else's house, you wore a hat. You didn't wear a hat maybe if you were entertaining in your own house, but all the other ladies would have worn a hat. But if you went out, you didn't take that hat off because nobody in public wanted to see you fussing with your hair. It was just very inappropriate to have done such a thing. But if you were a man and you were wearing a hat, you obviously wore the hat when you went outside. If you saw somebody that was just social better, you would take your hat off in respect. If you were going into your office, you would take your hat off. If you were going into a church, you would take your hat off. However, if you were going into a store, you would not take your hat off. If you were in a hotel lobby or a train station, you would not take your hat off because these places were public and it was disrespectful to take your hat off in these places. Nice little side note going on there. Most of the men had that very slick back hair oil look going on, so it helped a lot with the hat hair. So just a thought there. But as everything changes, we know, as the 1900s go on, we start coming to the war, and our women's hats, they become a little bit more subdued because of the war effort, and we, certainly wouldn't want people to think that we are more worried about our hats and our personal appearance than we were concerned about the war that was going on and so many people suffering. So, of course, hats got a little bit smaller and a little bit easier to take. And this is about the 1920s and the 1930s that we're looking at the cloche hat. It is C-L-O-T-H-E, and I always want to say close, but it is cloche. I checked that one out. But we look at smaller and smaller hats, such as this darling little hat here, and it is called a Briton, and it's set on the top of your head, and you can see our lace didn't have quite as good luck. Some women, of course, they took the men's style hats, which I'll show you in a second. This one is a modified bowler for a female hat. It's very close to the cloche, but it has more of a rounded head and it doesn't cover quite as much of your neck and your head. This one is called the toque. Look that one up too. This is a toque. It's also very similar to a turban style. And, I don't have it. Anyway, this one is called a toque. Sometimes they were also called shakos if they were very turban-y looking. This one from the 1960s is obviously a pillbox hat. This one is close to what we would call a fascinator, but is also kind of a beret. I like the little, I've worn this in one of my other videos, the rhinestones on there. This one is definitely a fascinator. It would have sat right on the front of your head with the veil showing. You might remember fascinators from the last royal wedding, and the bridesmaids were wearing fascinators. This one here is called a bumper, and I love this bumper. Now, I have 3 men's hats. This top hat is a costume hat. However, while these 2 are not vintage hats, they are real hats that were bought from a haberdashery in New Orleans. This one is one of my favorites. This is called the pork pie. And pork pie would have had the brim on it, and it would have had a very shallow hat brim, but the crown would be flat, as opposed to this bowler hat, which has the very rounded hat, and this would be called a bowler. And both of those hats began being very popular in about the 1800s. The pork pie hat obviously is well known for the jazz musicians in New Orleans. I mean, the bowler is it was worn about the same time that the top hats were. It was just a little bit more subtle and discreet than a top hat would be. And there are several different styles of top hats as well. I have a whole lot more information about hats and a lot of links both on the YouTube video here and on my blog. And there are a lot of different ways, a lot of different styles of hats, and some that I obviously didn't get to cover. So please check out my blog. It's at AuntieTinaSantiques.com. Or subscribe to my video, my YouTube channel if you haven't already. The subscribe button should be right down here on your right side. Also subscribe to the blog. There's a place to put on there so you get notified whenever I put something new up there. Alright, well, have fun. Next week we will be looking at vintage toys, and I'm excited about that one. So I will see you soon. Bye!